Today we ask the question, who wrote Isaiah? We're going to deal a little bit with the authorship of Isaiah, and this is an appropriate place because that question has usually been asked halfway through the reading of the book at the juncture of 39 and 40. So it's a good place to stop for a moment and just consider the questions related to the authorship of Isaiah. Well, we begin with some background. For 1,700 years was accepted as one prophet, one book, unity and authorship. Even though there were some early observations about a difference in a chapter here or some suggestions as to maybe a chapter written by another hand, it wasn't until the growth of higher criticism and really in the 18th century that questions about the unity of Isaiah were raised, and theories of multiple authorship suggested. So we're skipping a lot of background and a lot of history, suggestions along the way that some chapters were written by Ezekiel or other hands in various parts by various people until perhaps more than anybody else, Bernard Doom put it all together, made the suggestion based on many others before him that there were three different sections of Isaiah, or maybe authors, that the historical 8th century real Isaiah was 1 through 39, and then 40 through 55 was another Isaiah, sometimes called Deutero or Second Isaiah, which dealt mostly with the Babylonian exile, and then later suggested that there was actually a third Isaiah, Trito Isaiah, 56 through 66, and that was mostly post-exilic in perspective. So essentially three different Isaiahs, and not everybody was agreed as to how much, but for a while there were many, many Isaiahs or different reasons or groups, and now you have three basic Isaiahs undergirding the scholarly thinking. Well, along the way, critical methodologies were raising issues. That's one of the reasons why they had these suggestions. And we could look quickly at some reasons. One was literary criticism. The rise in literary criticism suggested changes in style or different phraseologies were responsible really by different authors or editors or people. You do see a change between 39 and 40. 40 verse 1, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God." This is different than 1 through 39, so it's a legitimate question. Why the change? Among other criticisms, form criticism, most notably Hermann Gunkel, introduced this, and it studied different kinds of genre. And there is poetry and prose, there are proverbs, there are other kinds of things, and so along the way, it was suggested that these different genres suggest different authors, different writers, and so that introduced more disunity into the book, into the discussion. More recently, some newer criticisms have changed it a little bit and brought some unity back to the discussion. So redaction criticism out of the 60s takes clues from the book itself, rhetorical devices, and suggests more unity when you're looking at things like repetition or inclusio, other clues that suggest units which were divided must be held together, and you have authorial suggestion for that. Canon criticism just basically says you need to start with the whole. Not everybody agrees as to what you do with it. That says you at least must accept the whole book of Isaiah in the whole Bible and start from there. So that is another movement towards unity. Where are we today? Well, it's hard to say. There's very little lack of agreement. Still undergirding it all is the acceptance by many people of three different Isaiahs, though not certainly by the prophet. It would be true to say that folks accept somewhere a core of real Isaiah material. They don't often agree on who or where. Usually it relates to 1 through 39. And then along the way, different communities, different editors added material, wove it in, rewrote it. And so the book is the work of many, many hands over a period of time. And that explains the growth and the differences in style of the book of Isaiah. Well, what about unity? We should look at the unity. One of the driving factors for disunity was the challenge to future predictive prophecy. Most of those scholars do not believe really that when Isaiah said this will happen in the future, and it happened in the future, that was predictive prophecy. So when Isaiah speaks about King Cyrus years and years before he's born, that for them must be dated to King Cyrus, as Isaiah could not have known that. So predictive prophecy is not allowed, and that certainly would change how things came together. But there are still a lot of folks who hold to unity. There is only one prophet Isaiah in the Bible and tradition throughout its book. Just one, just the name Isaiah. So strong case for unity there. Look at the internal connections. One good example would be Isaiah's favorite phrase for God, the Holy One of Israel. We see that some 26 times woven throughout the book of Isaiah, all over the place. And he's the one that uses it most. A few times in the Psalms and Jeremiah, once in Kings, I think. Mostly, it looks like later than Isaiah. So maybe Isaiah makes this phrase. It relates to his opening vision. He speaks of the holiness of God. So that is a strong unifying factor. Other themes like Israel's blindness, the way the Messiah is developed. So there are some other themes that suggest, even though you have differences in style, there's one author. What about the style? Well, one thing to consider is the historical situation. 1 through 39 is written under kings. We've seen that. A lot of politics involved, alliances with Egypt and Assyria is the main overarching political opposition, other nations around. So Isaiah's working in the court. So his historical situation relates to what he writes. As he perhaps retires or moves toward the future, 40 through 66 is a different kind of material. He has different visions. He's not working so much under particular kings. He's looking forward, and God is revealing the future to him. So yes, his style changes, but it changes with the situation. For sure, one author is possible of different styles and writing different genres. People who write letters back home have a different style when they write a thesis or a term paper for a college professor. There are different styles, there are different forms, but it's one author. So you have to be careful with some of the presuppositions that have been made along the way. What about manuscript evidence? Look at manuscript evidence. Probably the greatest manuscript find was the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the 40s. Some kids were looking in caves and found some jars with scrolls in them, and eventually they turned up on the market and were affirmed to be accurate, and this is the Dead Sea Scroll finds from Qumran. Among those finds, one complete scroll of Isaiah was found. Other scrolls of Isaiah were found, but 1Q Isaiah A, as it's been labeled, was a complete scroll, 66 chapters in amazing order, well preserved. It dates to about 150 BC, and it is already a copy of an older scroll. So it's a little older, so we can push the complete book of Isaiah well back to maybe 300 BC, or if you think it through, perhaps even older than that, and we're getting very close to the return from the exile with absolutely no suggestion of any other but one Isaiah. So this is interesting. Qumran, we look at Qumran. Qumran was a discovery down in the Dead Sea. This is the scriptorium where perhaps the Essenes, most people think, gathered together and they preserved the Word of God and copied it. And this is the scriptorium where they did that. Very accurate, very careful with the copying of Scripture. And maybe under Roman threat, as the Romans came, they hid the Scriptures. They hid them in caves. And this is one of the caves. As they later excavators went and found materials, they found the scrolls, they found the parchments, they found writings in these caves, and they're still finding them today. They're still discovering caves with other materials in them. As we said, they were found in jars. Some of them were preserved very nicely in jars, rolled up in clay jars for preservation. Jars were broken. Many of the scrolls had perished, but amazingly, the scroll of Isaiah had been preserved very well. If you think about it, this is a very interesting apologetic, because up until this time, the oldest really good scroll of Isaiah was around the 10th century A.D., maybe 900 and something A.D. That was the oldest copy of Isaiah that they had. And when they compared that to what was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls at 150 BC, 1,000 years older, there was very little difference. Some ways words were spelled or punctuation, that sort of thing, but letters used for punctuation or that, there was very little difference. They were very similar, which shows the accuracy of the scribal tradition over 1,000 years. So when people say, how do you know the Bible has been preserved accurately? How do you know it's what you really had originally? This is a great illustration on how well they preserve the Bible over years. In addition to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Ecclesiasticus, an apocryphal book from around 170 BC, only one Isaiah. When you look at the New Testament material, and you should look at that more carefully, the quotes in the New Testament are only from Isaiah. And the New Testament quotes Isaiah more than any other prophet. And that's a fascinating study to look at those quotes. So manuscript evidence, traditional evidence, only one Isaiah. To suggest that there were three different Isaiahs floating around, and there's absolutely no manuscript or traditional evidence for that, no memory, no evidence, it raises a question. Were they really different hands? Were they really editors? Why hasn't something been preserved? So where are we? Well, we can still make a case for essential unity of this book. Can you prove that every word was written by Isaiah? No, that's not the goal. Isaiah stands behind it. We're not in the position of proving things, but a very good case from the evidence that Isaiah is the person who wrote this book still stands. And work at the royal court, 1 through 39, actively under kings, different kind of environment than when he retires and he begins to work closer to the Lord and God's plan. Talks about the suffering servant, talks about the coming of Cyrus in the future, and then even more further, as he looks at the greater future, global role of Zion, salvation, the Gentiles, the new heavens and new earth, mostly in 55 through 66, yet another change and shift. So coming together, Isaiah is the basic author, and then Isaiah acts as his own editor to bring these things together, which is why we see some interesting comparisons between the opening chapters and the closing chapters. It has raised the eyebrows of many scholars to suggest that there's a greater unity here, at least in writing this book, because there's a cohesiveness from beginning to end. So just a quick review of the authorship of Isaiah. At least that gets us thinking about them, and well worth pursuing the idea of Isaiah. Yes, a great prophet of the Lord and used by the Lord to reveal his future for Israel.